Not a good weekend for the White House, not a good weekend for the argument that the White House has been making.
It isn't, and the real thing with Mueller here is he was able to actually put a lot of meat on the bones to these rumors that we've been hearing for so long. And the key is that this isn't over. You know, just last week, investigators were mentioning or testifying to Congress that in 2018, Russia was going to be trying to do the same thing. So you have to ask, what are Russia's goals in this? One is to cause chaos, that much is clear, and then two, it's to kind of to destroy the faith in public institutions. And if you're looking forward, maybe if Russia is playing a role here in 2018, it's that they're going to be trying to elect Democrats. They're going to be trying to work to elect Democrats, because what could be more chaotic than sending a bunch of Democrats to the White House and actually having them try to impeach the president?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Jay, let me, if I can, bring you into this. You know, for people who may not know Rick Gates' significance to the Trump campaign early on, this was a person who was very close to Paul Manafort, but he also was significant within the Trump inner workings during the campaign, right?
Absolutely, Eamon. And this is somebody who is very well positioned to know about almost everything that went on in that campaign, and has had a long history of dealing both with Paul Manafort, more than a decade, and also with Donald Trump. And so he has a lot of ammunition in which he can then turn around and really force Manafort into a very awkward position. Does Manafort now flip as well against the president, or does he sort of stay in the line and wage an incredibly expensive and very high stakes trial in which he's by no means assured to win? And so Rick Gates, his potential to flip here is really enormous news, because it has so much potential to go up the food chain here to Manafort and to others, and really force other kinds of pleas here, and that really builds a huge case potentially against the president himself.
And I will pick up on that point that Jay just brought up about what happens if Paul Manafort flips. But let me ask you this, Paul, as a former federal prosecutor, draw us the line, if you will, to connect us from the charges of fraud, which is what Rick Gates would potentially plead guilty to the overarching objective of the special counsel, which is Russia meddling in the 2016 elections. For some of us on the outside, we may not see what that connection is, but walk us through what would be the significance of somebody pleading guilty to fraud charges, but then ultimately his contribution to the Russians meddling in our elections.
Yeah, so Special Counsel Mueller knows that his charge is to investigate whether there was collusion between the Russians and the United States. The Trump campaign operatives to try to subvert democracy and steal the election, and whether there was obstruction of justice. So that's what it's all about. It's not at the end of the day about whether there were real estate transactions or fraud regarding the Ukraine. So pyramid prosecution, you start from the bottom, work your way up to the top. The bottom here is quite high if we look at the people who've been charged. So people like Michael Flynn, the former National Security Advisor, Paul Manafort, who was the president's campaign manager. And so Gates, again, he stayed on in the campaign even after Paul Manafort got fired. And so he knows some about the operation. He could answer questions like, when there were all these Trump campaign operatives running around meeting with the Russians, when the Russians were engaged in this effort to hack the election, could people high up in the Trump campaign not have known about that? Again, Gates is important because he's got the goods on Manafort. At the end of the day, I don't think that's the most important, because from a prosecution perspective, the charges against Manafort are really easy to prove. They're basically paper crimes that Mueller already has the evidence on. So I think he's especially interested, Mueller is, in what Gates knows about Trump.
So this is going to be more about what Gates knew about the Trump campaign than necessarily getting Manafort to flip.
Yeah, I can imagine that Paul Manafort, at the end of the day, is actually going to go to trial. He's looking at a huge exposure. It's obvious that Mueller has it in for him. Mueller's treating him like a so Mueller's going to put him under the jail unless, at the end of the day, Manafort cooperates.
And Evan, Manafort flipping, how significant of a setback would that be for the argument that the Trump campaign has been making, that there's been no collusion?
It would be horrible. But we've seen time and time again the president, whatever he says, it's undermined. We saw the president put out the tweet saying that Friday night that, the Mueller indictment on Friday was proof that there was no collusion. No, it wasn't. It was just 13 Russians who were indicted. And time again, the president has said that this is a Democratic hoax. I'm a Republican. I attack Democrats all the time for saying false things. But this is not a Democratic hoax. This was an attack on our nation by foreign power using sophisticated tools against us to divide the nation. And we have a president of the United States who is at odds with his own intelligence chiefs, some of whom he appointed, how some of them are career military men, and his own national security advisor at odds with them over whether or not this happened. He said in June of 2016, when the DNC hack was first reported, that it was probably done by the Democrats themselves just to create a storyline. Russia didn't do it. He's been defending him since June 2016, right around the time of the Trump Tower meeting.
Jay, let me pick up on that point that Evan was talking about there, that the president seems at times odd with his own staff. We just saw that in the last 24 hours with the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, in Germany, speaking at the Munich Security Conference, effectively saying that the evidence now is overwhelming. Everybody is accepting, from at least from his perspective, that the Russians meddled in the 2016 elections. And then immediately afterwards, you see the president tweet out directly at H.R. McMaster, pretty much saying, you forgot to mention that this had no impact on the results of the election. Hard to look at that tweet just within the past 24 hours and say this is not a White House in some kind of chaos on this singular issue.
Absolutely, Eamon. It's really striking to hear all these reports and see both sources, both Democrats and Republicans, and even White House officials in Munich at this national security conference, basically say, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain tweeting out certain things. We're here to talk about U.S. foreign policy. We're here to be serious. We're here to have serious, substantive discussions, and we're just going to pretend that all this stuff that's happening on Twitter is not really happening. And it's like as if there's two completely different governments going on right now, where there's the government of the United States negotiating with its European partners in Munich about security issues and long sort of standing NATO alliances, and then there's this other government, which is in Florida, Donald Trump, who's tweeting out all these things in contradiction to his own staff and to those folks in Munich right now. And it really shows how divided the government is and how divided, frankly, the White House is and separate the White House is, not just from Capitol Hill, but from a lot of Republicans on the Hill. It's of their own party.
And Nick, let me ask you, is the president increasingly out on an island here by himself when you have your national security advisor on foreign soil saying the evidence is overwhelming, incontrovertible, and yet the president is tweeting at him the exact opposite? The indictment on Friday, again, the president seeming to say this is not anything to do with the Trump campaign.
It's hard to imagine that he does it. He isn't on an island, especially when you have H.R. McMaster, who has always been a little bit more anti-Russia, a little bit more worried about that than Trump has since the very beginning, and this is really opening up. And you're seeing this rift open up between two of the biggest Trump allies within the White House, these groups, the family members and the generals, right? So you're looking at John Kelly this last week and around the indictment saying that we're not going to actually be releasing any more private intelligence information to these people who don't have security clearances. And that was a direct shot at the bow at Jared Kushner. And when you look at that and you see that action, who's going to win between the family and the generals? Well, Trump has been very consistent. He's been loyal to his family, and you gotta wonder if these are the last days for Kelly. You gotta wonder if maybe McMaster gets wrapped up in some of this stuff too.
And keep in mind, I always like to point this out, H.R. McMaster was known for, I think, writing the book on military generals speaking truth to power, particularly presidents, so he knows what it's like to be on the receiving end of presidential power, at least in pressure to stand up.
And he has to be sitting here wondering how in the world is this happening, because under almost any other White House administration, a report like this comes out and you're speaking out against Russia saying, we're going to stop this.
All right, Nick, thank you very much. Paul, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to ask Evan and Jay to stick around with us for a little bit more. And hours after students rallied against the president and the NRA, he puts the blame on Democrats.